Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Underwood. I work in community engagement at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis, and I'm so happy to welcome you to our program this evening, The Legacy of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, presented with support provided by Ameren, Missouri. If you would like to see captioning for this program, please be sure to click the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. We really appreciate you logging in for this virtual version of our Thursday Nights at the Museum series, which brings you fun, thought-provoking, perspective-shaping programs on a new topic every week. The weather dictated otherwise tonight, but normally we are live and in person with a happy hour and pop-up activities at 5:30 p.m., followed by a main stage program at 6:30 p.m. And as you may have seen in the slides that we're running, in the coming weeks, you can join us for programs that feature a discourse about race, violence, and justice, a concert dedicated to the women of ragtime, and a conversation with women working behind the scenes in the music industry. And we have tons of great stuff planned after that as well. You can see all of it at our events page at mohistory.org or on our Missouri History Museum Facebook page. We love that we can offer you most of our programs for free. The best way to make sure the programs stay free and accessible is to become a member or make a donation of any size. So we hope you'll consider that tonight. And if you're interested in learning more about membership, you can visit mohistory.org/support. And I'll put all these links I mentioned in the chat in a little while. We would also love to get your support by getting your feedback. Your input is really important to us. We hope you'll take a few moments at the end of the evening to fill out a SurveyMonkey survey that I will also link to in the chat. Our two presenters tonight are both authors. Candace O'Connor's new book is Climbing the Ladder, Chasing the Dream, The History of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And Dr. Priscilla Dowden White is the author of Groping Towards Democracy, African-American Social Welfare Reform in St. Louis, 1910 to 1949. Both of these books are available for purchase in the Missouri History Museum shop. You can order them online. If you order them in the next day, we will be able to get you a signed copy that we can send right to your doorstep. You can order the books through our shop at mohistory.org, or you can call the shop at 314-454-3172. And I'll post both the link and the number in the chat. And if you're a member, you're going to want to be sure to call that order in so you can get that member discount and give them your membership number. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get into the program. So here's how tonight is going to go. You're going to first hear from our two presenters who are going to share with you the history of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And then after that, one of our presenters, Dr. Priscilla Dowden White, is going to moderate a conversation with additional wonderful panelists, Dr. Will Ross from Washington University School of Medicine, and Okunsola Amadu, who is the founder and CEO of Jama Birth Village. And they're going to bring the conversation about Black healthcare and Black medical practitioners up into the current day. And we're going to save a little bit of time for questions, at the end. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A feature to post your question to us. We might just have time to get to a couple, but we'll do the best we can. And at this time, I'm going to introduce you to both of our presenters, and then I'll turn the program over to them and hide in the background. So our first presenter is Dr. Priscilla Dowden White, Associate Professor of History at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and author of the aforementioned Groping Towards Democracy. She holds a BA in History from the University of Missouri St. Louis, an MPS in African and African American Studies from Cornell University, and a PhD in History from Indiana University Bloomington. Dr. Dowden White has been a featured scholar in several historical documentaries, including Sing It, Tell It, a documentary exploring African American musical heritage in Missouri. Her scholarly interests include social welfare and civic activism among African Americans during the interwar period of World War I to World War II. And she's also involved in global and local mission through African Methodist Episcopal Church. I should also mention that Dr. Dowden White served on the advisory board for the Missouri History Museum's #1 in Civil Rights exhibit and has also served on our Collections and Exhibits Committee. After Priscilla, you're going to hear from Candace O'Connor, an award-winning St. Louis-based freelance writer and editor. Candace also is a graduate from Cornell and specializes in historical and medical writing. She's the author of 13 books on Midwest history, including books on Barnes Jewish Hospital, St. Louis Children's Hospital, Washington University, Frankie Muse Freeman, and the Chase Park Plaza. And her newest publication is, again, the aforementioned Climbing the Ladder, Chasing the Dream. For more than 3 decades, her stories have appeared in local and national publications. And in 2001, she also won a regional Emmy Award for her PBS documentary, Oh Freedom After While, the Missouri Sharecropper Protest of 1939. We are so happy to have both Priscilla and Candace with us this evening. And Priscilla, I'm going to turn it over to you. The screen is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to Dr. Fran Levine and to the entire Missouri Historical Society family. I'm indeed honored to serve as both presenter and moderator for this evening's program, sharing this platform with our distinguished panel tonight for this timely discussion on the legacy of Homer G. Phillips Hospital and healthcare concerns today coming out of that. This evening, I will start us out by sharing a few comments on the movement that led to the establishment of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. After which I'll turn things over to my co-presenter, Ms. Candace O'Connor, whose book I'm excited about and looking forward to reading. So for context, it's important for us to know and keep in mind that the social movement that culminated in the establishment of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, along with the first 2 decades of the hospital's existence, occurred during the first half of the 20th century, which constitutes the most entrenched period of racial segregation this nation has known. If we look at the entire history of the nation prior to the 20th century and its history since the mid-20th century, we won't find another period that is comparable to these first 5 decades of the 20th century in terms of racial segregation and its institutional entrenchment. Why? Largely because of 2 US Supreme Court cases that serve as judicial bookends for this period. Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 ruling by the Supreme Court that laid the legal foundation for separate but equal. And on the other end of the close of that period is the Brown decision in 1954 rather, when the US Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated public schools were inherently unequal. But in between those years, from 1896 to 1954, this nation witnessed more institutions erected in the name of racial segregation than in any period of the nation's history. As a result of racial segregation being the law of the land, African Americans and their allies had to figure out a way to transmute segregation into power. This is a phrase and a strategy that W.E.B. Du Bois adopted in the 1930s upon the realization that at that particular moment, the walls of racial segregation appeared and for all practical purposes were immovable, at least for the time being. But Du Bois was late coming to this strategy because this was a strategy transmuting segregation into power that Booker T. Washington had already perfected. In spite of racial segregation, and in some ways because of it, in St. Louis, we find a dynamic community of social welfare and community and civic organizers, Black and white, working together to ensure that Black St. Louisans had adequate access to the public welfare. Hospitals, of course, constituted one of those areas at the opening of the 20th century. Healthcare and hospitals, therefore, were a high priority among the concerns that African Americans in St. Louis and in many other cities and rural communities throughout the country had at that time in this segregated era. In 1910, this is the progressive era, keep in mind, an organization, actually it's a committee of 15 members, comes into being. And the name of that committee is the Committee for Social Service Among Colored People. And this committee was composed of 5 whites from the Social Service Conference that existed at that time, 5 Black men who were members of an organization called the Forum Club, and 5 Black women who were members of the Colored Women's Club. In 1910, the Committee for Social Service Among Colored People, the committee that would eventually form the first members of the St. Louis Urban League, but that's later in 1917. In 1910, the committee conducted what was in all likelihood the first study of its kind on the conditions of African Americans living in St. Louis. The study found that a number of hospitals discriminated against African American patients. It also found that there were no provisions for what were called at that time tubercular colored people. Being highly contagious, tuberculosis caused the most widespread public concern in the 19th and early 20th centuries as an endemic disease of the urban poor. Progressive era reformers' desire to find order in their society at the turn of the century fostered a growing interest in racial susceptibility of tuberculosis. As one historian of African American medical history has observed, while the threat posed by African Americans to the white population was exaggerated, it served a purpose. The notion that the problem of tuberculosis was primarily one of the Negro race was perpetuated through African American organizations as well as white organizations. African American social welfare community organizers understood that the key to the Black community's access to public health care and its resources was the larger community's realization that as long as the health of one element of the community is not sufficiently safeguarded, all are in danger. In my research for Groping Toward Democracy, I found that there were several organizations that were interested in this issue, but there were 2 organizations that I found were really prominent in not only the movement for overall healthcare of African Americans, but these 2 organizations ended up having a great deal of influence during the debate over the location of what would eventually be known as Homer G. Phillips Hospital, the St. Louis Urban League and the League of Women Voters. These 2 organizations and other African American organizations worked in conjunction with the Tuberculosis and Health Society of St. Louis to perform much of the tuberculosis work during the period. Segregation fostered a relationship of mutual dependence between African American healthcare professionals and the African American community. Their separate plights were inextricably linked. Public health, though segregated, provided the first solid avenue that pre-World War II Black physicians and nurses could take into their city's larger medical professional community. As the impact of the Great Migration set in and racial segregation held sway, it became increasingly apparent that St. Louis's only Black public hospital, which at the time was City Hospital number 2 for colored, could no longer adequately address the needs of the community. A League of Women Voters survey observed, it is a well-known fact that City Hospital number 2 is entirely inadequate in space and equipment for meeting the situation created by the recent large influx of colored patients. Consequently, the institution is in a chronic state of overcrowding. From the opening of the hospital, City Hospital number 2 that is, in 1918, until January 1936, the year before Homer G. Phillips Hospital opened, the practicing Black physicians of St. Louis who treated patients at City Hospital number 2 occupied the position of associate staff members. No cases were assigned to them except those verbally delegated by the visiting attending staff. The local Black press questioned the conditions of City Hospital number 2, and in particular, the positions available to Black healthcare professionals. Few organized voices of dissent surfaced on the question of the need for a new Negro health facility. The St. Louis Community Council, which was an umbrella organization, a clearinghouse for city officials, clearinghouse that was made up of a wide variety of organizations that dealt with social welfare concerns. The St. Louis Community Council, the Tuberculosis and Health Society, the St. Louis Urban League, and the League of Women Voters, and various other public service organizations all agreed that the health of the entire St. Louis community would be threatened if an additional healthcare facility for the city's African-American population was not built soon. The passage of the 1923 bond issue reflected in part a general consensus for this need. Now, that bond issue had set aside $1.2 million appropriated for the new Negro hospital, but it would prove insufficient for its completion. The location debate, however, turned out to be the central issue delaying the construction of the hospital. There was a sharp racial divide. One of the most revealing accounts of the racial underpinnings of this issue was featured in a short story written in the 1930s by a white civic leader and writer named Fannie Cook. Deeply engaged in the city's civic community, Cook was an active member of the League of Women Voters. She was Race Relations Committee Chairman of the St. Louis Community Council from 1930 to 1934, and supported the rights of workers, including domestic workers, to organize under federal policies established by the New Deal. I would like to read to you a brief excerpt from Fannie Cook's short story titled Black Liberty, as it describes the racial divide on the hospital issue. It reads, on that issue, the location of the new Negro hospital, Mrs. Adams locked horns with everyone from the mayor down to me. Back of her, the entire colored community pulled together. Usually the Negro citizens are divided in their opinions, some backing each side of a many-sided problem. But this time they were united. Against them, also united, the white community lined up in opposition. This unanimity was even more unusual. Shoulder to shoulder stood white doctors who thought all colored men should be porters. Other white doctors who habitually sacrificed their personal advantage in order to extend courtesies to their colored conferees. White politicians who thought Negroes were just people from whom to buy votes, and white women who were used to working on committees with Mrs. Adams. Now, public records stand alongside this fictional account and further illuminate the racial contours of the location debate. Most accounts followed the lines of a report issued by the American Public Health Association, which described the debate between the municipal government and the colored community. The majority of Black physicians and the organized African-American social welfare community favored the building of an entirely new separate facility in, as the report described, a northwest section of the city in a neighborhood of well-to-do colored families, but distant from districts where the great bulk of the Negro population lived. This side likewise argued that the location of City Hospital number 1 for whites was unsuitable for a hospital of any kind, as it was not centrally located and was in a manufacturing and railroad district. The other point of view held by the Department of Public Welfare, the St. Louis Medical Society, a limited number of African Americans, and a considerable number of those whites who had given thought to the subject, called for the hospital to be located adjacent to City Hospital number 1 and to be operated as an integral part of the institution. From a financial point of view, the location of the new Negro hospital at City Hospital number 1 for whites would mean, quote, large savings in initial investment and annual savings in the operating cost, as many of its departments were of sufficient capacity and could be enlarged at relatively little cost to serve an additional hospital unit of 300 to 400 beds. In 1928, the political climate around the new Negro hospital debate heated up as the Board of Aldermen's vote was courted heavily. The League of Women Voters Colored Committee decided unanimously to make its position known to the city mayor, the director of public welfare, and to the Board of Aldermen, arguing that the new Negro hospital would be erected, quote, separate and away from City Hospital number 1. The committee's position was that only in this way can the colored people of St. Louis be assured of the benefits to be gained by such a plan. According to the League, these benefits would be threefold: a colored hospital managed entirely by colored physicians, hospital training for colored interns, and training for colored nurses. The St. Louis Urban League's involvement with the new Negro hospital issue began in 1928 when Black physicians approached the Urban League, directly approached Mr. John T. Clark, who was the executive secretary of the Urban League, and asked if the Urban League could step in and support the doctors in the location debate. The Urban League, along with the larger umbrella organization that I mentioned earlier, the St. Louis Community Council, felt it important and necessary that if this support would be given, it would not be given for the exclusive reason of the doctors needing to have a place to practice, but that the argument would have to be made that the hospital was needed to serve the colored community of indigent colored community. And that's what they were called at that time, which meant African Americans who were not able to pay for their health care themselves. Of course, things were quite different then. We did not have the insurance that we have now. And I'm sure, as we will hear in our panel discussion, there are still many roadblocks to adequate health care for people who belong to various groups in particular. So I am going to stop here. I hope that I have given an adequate context for my co-presenter to step in and dig deep and double down on the actual hospital, Homer G. Phillips Hospital. So I turn it over to you, Candace.
Well, thanks so much to the Missouri Historical Society and to Emily Underwood for organizing this discussion. And thanks to Priscilla for setting such wonderful context for what I'm going to be telling you about. So let me see if I can get my slides up here. Try again here. There we go. That should do it, I hope. I hope everybody can see that. Is that clear now? You should be looking at a cartoon, a newspaper cartoon.
We've got it now, Candace. Thank you.
Okay, great. This is a chilling cartoon, isn't it? It appeared in a St. Louis newspaper in 1933. You'll see the frightened Black patient beset by disease, the hooded figure, is getting no help at all from the hospitals underneath him. And all the while, death is waiting in the wings. See the bony hand to the left. Was this an exaggeration? Not at all. Priscilla has mentioned tuberculosis, which claimed 3 times more Black lives than it did white. Okay. In the 1920s, St. Louis had 2 private Black hospitals, St. Mary's, which was downtown, and People's Hospital, which is still on Locust Street. The building is still there. But there were also 2 public hospitals. Priscilla mentioned the much better equipped White City Hospital number 1 on the south side. And this is the hospital she also mentioned, City number 2, which was established in a dreary old Midtown building in 1919. The hospital was shoddy, ill-equipped, and with only 200 beds, it was much too small. Almost as soon as it opened, newspapers were editorializing about that, quote, ramshackle fire trap. Those cries only intensified after one of the 11 Black residents there was electrocuted while using a defective X-ray machine. An idealistic young Black attorney in town, Homer Garland Phillips, became interested in this cause. He had come from his hometown of Smithton, Missouri, which is just outside of Sedalia, where he'd been the second to last child in a large family. His father, Samuel, was a Union veteran of the Civil War and a small-time farmer. While some of his brothers became laborers, Homer had higher ambitions. The Methodists had just founded a new college for Black students in Sedalia. Homer Phillips found some way to attend. We're not quite sure how, but we think that he must have depended on a substantial scholarship support. Afterwards, he worked for a year so that he could go on to Howard University Law School. And imagine what ambition that took to go from tiny Smithton all the way to Washington, D.C. But before he left, he did something surprising. He changed his name, and we're not sure why. At birth, he was John Wesley Phillips, but at this point, he became Homer Garland Phillips. And we don't know why Homer, why Garland. And there's another naming mystery later on too, if I can jump ahead to his death. His gravestone in St. Peter's Cemetery is labeled Homer Gilliam Phillips. So why not Garland? We don't know that either. So he graduated from Howard, and after a few years in Sedalia, he moved to St. Louis around 1911, married a budding actress, Ida Pearl Alexander, and began a busy law practice. He also volunteered with the NAACP and, as I said, took up the cause of a new hospital for Black patients. He was well aware that there was a national movement to build Black hospitals, and he began pushing, along with the others that Priscilla has mentioned, for a freestanding hospital in St. Louis that would have a Black medical and nursing staff and a large number of Black trainees. He and others wanted it to be located in the Ville, a thriving Black community on the north side, partly because of racially restrictive covenants that excluded Blacks from certain white neighborhoods. The Ville had a broad mix of residents, teachers and janitors, doctors and meat packers. It also had prominent Black churches, such as Antioch Baptist, and cultural icons, and you can see some of them on this map, such as Poro College, which had been built by Annie Malone for her beauty product business. While Homer Phillips continued to fight for this new hospital, he made a few key enemies. One was the St. Louis mayor, Victor Miller. Another was the McFarland family. They were clients of his who thought he had overcharged them in a legal matter. And yet another was fellow Black attorney, George Vaughn, who in 1931 was accused of hiring witnesses to support a client's false testimony, which is called in legal terms, suborning perjury. Homer Phillips had uncovered positive proof that Vaughn was guilty and was on the verge of testifying against him in court. In fact, he was the star witness and maybe really the only significant witness, which would have meant Vaughn's disbarment. On June 18th, 1931, Phillips walked to his usual streetcar stop on Delmar, where he was accosted by two young men, one of them from the McFarland family that I mentioned. They fired 6 shots at him, killing him instantly. The young men were quickly arrested and had no alibis, but within days, they had somehow acquired 3 witnesses who swore they were across town at the time of the murder. Does that sound to you as though they had help? And from whom do you think? What person have we talked about who had that similar way of doing things? Oops. At trial, the young men were acquitted and the case is officially unsolved. George Vaughn was also acquitted at his trial and continued to practice law. The new hospital went forward at last. Oops, sorry. And the Board of Aldermen voted to name it for Homer G. Phillips. So the magnificent new Homer G. Phillips Hospital for the Colored, as it was originally called, was dedicated in a gala 1937 celebration. Look at the 10,000 people attending. There was a parade, tours of the hospital, and a speech by Harold Ickes, who was Secretary of the Interior under Franklin Roosevelt. Here's the beautiful complex designed by city architect Albert Osberg in earth tone brick with terracotta bands. And it really was just a gorgeous building. It had 5 parts. You can see in the center the administrative core. There were 4 clinical wings radiating from it, like one might be 4 South might have been the pediatrics floor, or 5 North might have been the urology floor. There was the nursing school was out back. You see that large building, and just in front of it was the trainees' dormitory. You see the smokestack there. That was the laundry maintenance complex behind the main building. The hospital got off to a busy start with 300 patients transferring from city number 2. And remember that city number 2 only had 200 beds. So that tells you there were 100 patients in the hallway. And more are arriving every day. There were 685 beds at Homer G and more than 500 staff members. The first medical director was Dr. Henry Hampton, father of the Henry Hampton who created the PBS series Eyes on the Prize. Oops. This new hospital also had room for talented interns and residents. Oops, wait a second. There they are. Who couldn't find training slots in white hospitals. By 1939, Homer G was accepting at least half the Black medical graduates in the United States. And let me just add that these trainees are standing right in front of the hospital. That's the entrance to it. Working alongside these trainees were more than 100 nurses, as well as nursing students who had arrived from various states for their training. Many came from the rural South and had to scrape together the tuition money, which was around $350 for the 3-year program, by doing domestic work, or by borrowing money from hard-pressed relatives. Let me tell you a quick story about how important and knowledgeable these nurses were. This is a story told me by a doctor, a trainee rather, who'd come over from Washington University to learn about obstetrics. He had never seen a delivery before. So this doctor told me that he had just come up the elevator to the OB floor when a nurse met him in the hallway. "Young doctor," she said, "I have bad news. The doctor you were going to meet today had car trouble, and you will have to deliver the baby." He was panicked. He said, "Nurse, I can't do that. I haven't had the course yet." "Young doctor," she said calmly, "you are having the course right now." With the nurse's help, that young doctor did deliver the baby successfully. And what did he think of that nurse? "Oh, she was wonderful," he said. Let's see if I can get to the right slide. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with these slides. The nurses often went the extra mile to help their patients. One nurse, Lillian Haywood, told me the story of an indigent woman who had given birth at the hospital. When she left, she forgot her blanket. So Ms. Haywood decided to drop by the home address the woman had given. When she got there, she discovered the young woman was living in an unheated garage with only a space heater for warmth, and she was keeping her baby's milk cold in the snow. So Ms. Haywood went back to the hospital, reported this to the social workers, and they were able to find her an apartment. As Ms. Haywood said to me, "We might have saved 2 lives that day." Altogether, there were more than 100 nurses as well as nursing students who had come for their training, but they were taught by teachers who were wonderful teachers, but very tough. Let's see if I can call up the picture here of one of them, who was a teacher named Miss Mabel C. Northcross. Oops, not that yet. Not quite. Oh, try again. Well, it's just not cooperating with me. I think you saw, you had a glance at Miss Northcross before. Whoops, you had another glance. Nope, nope, nope. Okay. One more try, and then I'm just going to tell you about her. Okay, well, we'll give up on that. But at Homer, Miss Northcross, she was known privately as Ole Miss, and she ruled in the operating room. She ordered late trainees out of the OR, and she wrapped slow nurses with her forceps. Still, many persevered, knowing well, as they told me, that failure was not an option. The 40s and 50s were booming years at the hospital. During World War II, many nurses were admitted as cadet nurses in training to assist the war effort. Nurse Georgia Anderson told me that Homer G was a happy place in the 1950s. We felt that what we were doing was of value to the community and the world, and it was. Take a look at some statistics that show how busy the hospital was then. Admissions hovered around 12,000 annually, and the number of surgeries was always high, partly because of the excellent but crowded emergency room. Soon they had 400 births a month. In fact, 3/4 of the African-American babies born in St. Louis were delivered at Homer G. That's another reason why that doctor from Barnes, the trainee, was coming over, because there were always babies being born at Homer G. Phillips. So who were some of the heroes among the physicians during this period? At the top of the list was eminent surgeon, Dr. William Sinkler, who had been a trainee at City No. 2 himself. He devoted his life to Homer G as medical director and then head of surgery. And not only did he teach surgical techniques, but he ingrained in the students respect for their patients. Another hero was the OBGYN surgeon, William Smiley, who had an almost magical operating room style. He could put various instruments, such as scissors or a clamp, on his fingers and flip up whichever one he needed. One person told me that he was actually a one-man band. Or how about Dr. James Whitico, a longtime surgeon at the hospital? Oops, there he is. I spoke to him when he was nearly 100, but he still remembered his first sight of Homer G when he was a new trainee. As he drove toward it, he was overcome with emotion at seeing such a building, not shabby, not second rate, as most facilities for African Americans were then. In fact, he had to pull his car over to the curb on Whittier Street to compose himself. All he could do was murmur, "Oh my God, oh my God." I heard over and over about sister and brother pediatricians, Doctors Helen and Homer Nash. I bet some in the audience today remember either one of the doctors Nash. Helen Nash was a brilliant doctor, but also an exacting one. Dr. Homer Nash, on the other hand, was also excellent, but a very different personality. One nurse called him a gentle giant. One last thing I'd like to mention about the 40s and 50s was the exemplary role that Washington University School of Medicine played in sending key staff to assist with training or administration. Dr. Robert Ellman was one of them, and he served for years as head of surgery, establishing truly collegial, not condescending relationships with staff and trainees. During the 1960s and beyond, many things at Homer G. Phillips remained the same. Nurses still came to be trained and received their caps during a moving ceremony after 6 months of study. Those caps, incidentally, had to be perfectly stiff. Those students found an easy way to do that. They slathered them with faultless starch and flattened them against the dorm room mirrors to dry. But most important was their graduation. Suddenly, these young women and some men could find good jobs and become solid members of the middle class. But in other ways, the hospital soon began to change and change dramatically. Dr. Sinkler and Dr. Ellman died suddenly around 1960, and the close relationship with the School of Medicine began to end. After the Supreme Court decision ended racially restrictive covenants in 1948, the Ville began to lose population and much of its vibrancy. The city of St. Louis was also losing population to the suburbs, and its tax base was shrinking. So it began eyeing its two public hospitals with a view to closing one of them. But which one? A confidential study showed that Homer G operated more efficiently than City Number 1, but Homer G needed major updating. But many felt that it was doomed because of racism. As Dr. H. Philip Venable noted angrily, Homer Phillips had everything, but the only thing against it was that it was Black. What's more, the civil rights era was in progress and residency programs began to dwindle. Increasingly, trainees came from overseas, and nationally, those Black hospitals I mentioned were closing. With new Medicare and Medicaid legislation, the census at Homer G began to decline as patients began using other hospitals as well. In the late 1960s, the city merged the nursing programs at City Number 1 and Homer G, creating a new school, an integrated school, the St. Louis Municipal College of Nursing, which closed in 1981. Through its history, Homer G had trained more than 1,000 nurses. In 1977, Mayor James Conway took office on a platform of keeping Homer G open, but his comptroller, Raymond Persich, was committed to closing one of the hospitals. Some white newspapers favored retaining City Number 1, but Black supporters of Homer G countered with protests, sit-ins, and rallies. Nearly 50 people were arrested after trying to meet with Mayor Conway. Celebrities even came to town. I think Jimmy Carter's mother, Miss Lillian, came, but so did comedian Dick Gregory to express support and sometimes find themselves arrested. Early on the morning of August 17, 1971, staff members were coming to work at Homer G as usual when they heard helicopters overhead and saw busloads of police arriving. The hospital, except the emergency ward and clinic, was closing, and the city had managed to keep its plans secret. Mayor Conway later said that he was pleased it had gone so smoothly. But he was not so pleased in the next election when he lost the primary to Alderman Vincent Schamel, who promised to reopen Homer G. And in fact, Mayor Schamel did propose a bond issue to do so, but it didn't garner the required 2/3 majority. So the hospital remained closed, and only 6 years later, City Number 1 closed as well. Homer G. Phillips sat vacant and deteriorating for years. Then in 2002, a kind of miracle occurred. Developer Sharon Robnet launched a lavish $42 million renovation and reopened the hospital as a beautiful senior living facility. As one nurse told me gratefully, "It has risen up out of the ashes like a phoenix," she said. "It is still there." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candace. Now we're going to transition into the second part of our program tonight, where we will talk more directly about the legacy of Homer G. Phillips Hospital and issues around African American healthcare delivery, and perhaps even issues if they exist for healthcare professionals. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our two panelists this evening that we will be talking to about these issues. First, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Okushola M. Amadou. Okushola M. Amadou. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
You did. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Amadou is the first Black certified professional midwife in Missouri, and that deserves applause. So we don't see you, but please give some applause. She founded the Jama Birth Village in 2015, starting the St. Louis Black Doula movement and growing the St. Louis Black Doula community from 5 to over 200 in 5 years through her community doula training, the city's first Black written, created, and taught community-based doula training. In 2018, Ms. Amadou created the St. Louis Doulas of Color Collective, which is home to Missouri's first BIPOC doula directory. Amadou is a 2019 graduate of the Midwives College of Utah, and she was awarded the 2020 Alumni of the Year Award for her extraordinary work in community-based midwifery care in the St. Louis region. Welcome, Ms. Amadou.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really happy to be here with you all.
Thank you. And also joining us for our discussion this evening is Dr. Will Ross, who is the Associate Dean for Diversity at Washington University School of Medicine and Professor of Medicine in the Nephrology Division. Over the past 2 decades, he has recruited and developed a diverse workforce of medical students, residents, and faculty while promoting health equity locally, nationally, and globally. As a public health and health policy expert, Dr. Ross focuses on systems integration and conceptual frameworks to reduce healthcare disparities. He is a co-founder of the Bournes Jewish Hospital Center for Diversity and Cultural Competence, and served on the task force that created the Washington University Institute for Public Health. He is vice chair of the Washington University Commission on Diversity and Inclusion, and he has been instrumental in redesigning local access to healthcare for the underserved as the founder of the Saturday Neighborhood Health Clinic and co-founder of Casa de Salud Latino Health Center. Dr. Ross is also a founding member of the Collegiate College of Medicine and Bioscience, a magnet health professions high school in St. Louis. Dr. Ross is chairman or a member of many boards and has received numerous honors and awards. A graduate of Yale University, he completed medical school at Washington University School of Medicine, an internal medicine residency at Vanderbilt University, and a renal fellowship at Washington University. He completed a Master's of Science in Epidemiology at the St. Louis University School of Public Health. Welcome, Dr. Ross.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I have a few questions that I'd like to pose, and we want to leave some time for our audience to be able to ask questions. So we plan to wrap up at approximately 8 p.m. this evening. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get through all of the questions that I've outlined for you, but we'll do our best. And also leave time for our audience. So the first question is, Homer G. Phillips Hospital was created to fill a particular void created by racial segregation in healthcare delivery to lower income African Americans. Now that we no longer have racially segregated healthcare institutions, what challenges, if any, might uninsured or underinsured Black citizens face today in adequate healthcare access? And I pose that question to both you, Ms. Amadou, and to you, Dr. Ross.
Please, Ms. Amadou.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to start, Dr. Ross?
No, no, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the first thing that came to my mind when I heard that question is trust. If we think about the information that was just shared by Dr. Priscilla and Candace as well, really we're understanding that there is a long history of the people of color, Black people in the city of St. Louis being treated in a very treacherous manner, not having access to the high level of quality care that they deserve, and really being, being discriminated against at every turn. So now that the healthcare sector is no longer segregated, Black people in the community still have trust issues with these same systems. So really just understanding how do we help to transition and change the trusting relationships between doctors and facilities that are really rooted in some of these same policies and old ideologies from in the early 1900s when these hospitals did exist. So although we do have more access, I do see a lot of community members, especially pregnant Black women that come to our clinic. They pretty much say the same thing. We do not trust the hospitals. We do not trust the providers. And they really need support in helping to navigate finding providers who they can trust and build those relationships with. So if we can really work in that dynamic, that means that we have to focus on hospital policies really being decolonized in a sense to where we're looking at what policies are outdated, what policies are old and still are remnants of those times when segregation was prominent in the city. And that will then be a trickle effect with providers now having to change their attitudes and maybe going through cultural congruency training and understanding if they are fit to be in the healthcare sector, depending on their attitudes and their biases that may exist towards Black people. So that's a bit of my perspective on it. The air is still distrust because of the history that has been shared this evening.
Yes,
Well,
that's I was just gonna say that I'm glad you brought up the trust issue, and I'm sure Dr. Ross probably will add something to that. The most immediate issue that came to mind was vaccinations, COVID vaccinations. And you hear, and it's not just, of course, within the African American community, but I have had conversations with African Americans who have actually mentioned the history of the history that has caused this distrust. So I'm glad you brought that up. Dr. Ross?
yeah, well, I think that was spoken very eloquently by Ms. Amadou, and there's abundant data indicating that African-American patients are indeed more willing and more likely to seek care from ethnically similar, racially concordant providers. We know that, and they're more likely to consider that care better, much more loving, caring, much more comprehensive than from other providers. And because they, African American patients are looking for that concordance, no, they're in this current situation where we don't have the public hospitals, the confluence of all those wonderful African American physicians and nurses in one place. African American patients don't know where to go and find that type of care, of holistic care, and they feel left out because of this issue of distrust. So the data certainly corroborates what Ms. Amadou outlined. We also recognize the data certainly documents that African Americans are more likely to be uninsured or underinsured. And while hospitals have policies to care for a certain number of patients who are uninsured or underinsured, a significant number of those patients won't seek care until they're at their last stages of an illness or more acute illness. As a consequence, they're going to have poor outcomes, a greater likelihood of complications and even death. Because A, they're not insured or uninsured, and B, there's a distress issue, and C, there's not a centralization of African American providers who can reach out to that population. That's a consequence of the closing of not just Homer G. Phillips Hospital, but similar hospitals across the country. And unfortunately, the data showing the disparities, the reduced life expectancy and other complications still persist to this day, because we haven't been able to recreate the type of caring community that we had back in the heyday of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital.
Thank you. So Candace and I have emphasized in both of our presentations the challenges that Black medical professionals had during the era of entrenched racial segregation, during the existence of most of the existence of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. Are there any challenges that Black medical professionals face today?
Well, yes, and they're the same challenges. You have to recognize that in the past 30 years, the percentage of African American graduates from U.S. medical schools has been unchanged. And in fact, if you look at the number of Black men coming out of U.S. medical schools, a study that was published in 2014 by Mark Neve showed that the numbers were lower in 2014 than there were in 1980 when I started medical school. The numbers were lower. And so we're simply aren't producing the number of physicians, male or female, Black physicians, compared to the need in the community. And again, that gap is there, and that gap translates into poor access to care, and the associated poor outcomes. So unfortunately, here we are in 2022, and we still have that gap. Less than 6% of all physicians, I shouldn't say physicians, I should say physicians, that is a physician's number. All physicians in this country are African American, less than 6%. The number is actually 5.5%. And let's not talk about the small number of advanced practice nurses, midwives, and others. Those numbers are vanishingly small. And so this story of Homer G. Phillips Hospital should be fodder for all of us to really push assertively to increase the training of physicians and providers of color who can provide the type of culturally appropriate care that Ms. Amadou mentioned.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that, Dr. Ross. And that was my first thought. we are experiencing the same thing, same things that many of our communities are facing, and many of our community members are facing when they go to seek out care in this healthcare system. So the same racism and biases that are embedded in policies and structures and systems are also at the educational level. And, I talk a lot about the erasure of Black midwives. Currently, as of today, Black midwives only make up 2% of the entire midwifery population. So to support what Dr. Ross has said, it's greatly lower than the 6% of Black physicians that are accounted for in this country. And that 2% number is not by mistake. That was instinctively carried out by an act that was passed in 1920s, 1921 actually, called the Shepard-Towner Act. And that act was really meant to try to help to lower incidences of infant mortality. And it was supposed to pour money into communities to advance public health. But if we think about the 1920s, when racism was rampant and segregation was as well, what it did, instead of helping to educate and train the 15,000 plus midwives who were mostly condensed in the southern part of the United States, it actually eradicated them because it made education and access to that unreachable for many of these midwives who practiced in rural communities. So with the erasure of those trusted midwives, as we just talked about, how trust is important, Dr. Ross did an amazing job highlighting how we feel loved and cared for, felt and seen when we are care for people who live down the street from us and maybe have provided care for generations of family members. So with the erasure of that, we had higher incidences of people maybe birthing alone or going into the hospital and being practiced on, without the respect that they would have received from a midwife. So again, there is now a big influx of people entering midwifery college at this time to try to improve maternal health outcomes in Black communities. However, the barriers, when we think about a lot of the people who are becoming midwives specifically, their parents themselves, they're parenting at the time, they have younger children, they may have to work another job, and while also being on call as a student and going to school. So the burnout rate and the dropout rate is very high. And although I'm the first Black certified professional midwife in the state, I work really hard to, bring other Black women along the journey and to support them and to help them understand what the challenges are so they can succeed in becoming a midwife. It was very, very hard for me to accomplish that goal. And there were many barriers in the way that made me want to just say, forget it multiple times. I had to actually leave the state of Missouri and go to an entirely different state, Virginia, actually, just to complete my primaries to become a midwife. That's just how strong the racial barriers are in this state.
That's a lot of history there, and so we have to remember the desire, the motivating force for physicians to relocate to St. Louis. After 1910, a report from Abraham Flexner, who was charged by the Carnegie Foundation to oversee U.S. medical schools, concluded that a number of the African-American schools were subpar and they were closed. A lot of schools were subpar at that time, but there was a disproportionate closure of African-American students at a time of African-American schools of medicine at a time when there was a great need. And so there were very few training programs. When Homer G. Phillips opened up, given the magnitude of that building, given the resources that were there, it was just a magnet for some of the best providers in the country, not the St. Louis, not the Midwest, but the country. It was the anchor to bring them there because there was such a need to have that training. And boy, did they perform. One of the ways that we know they performed was the outcomes in maternal child health. The infant mortality rate was just considerably improved during that period from 1937 to 1979. Other facets of maternal child health improved because you had this high quality, you had this clustering, you had this this engagement of nurses and physicians and others, in this really interprofessional manner, and in the sense that they care for each other, they love each other, and outcomes are wonderful. And so it was in response to and I should state the racist approaches that led to the closing of a number of medical schools. It was in response to that the quality of care at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, as well as other hospitals that were African American, improved, because there was something to prove, that something to say that our people deserve better care.
Well, thank you. The both of you covered a lot of ground in your answer to that question, and you've already begun to infer perhaps some issues that are at the heart of the next question that I'm going to ask you, but maybe we need to be more explicit about this. So from your perspective, what are some of the most pressing healthcare concerns present in the African American community today?
I'll start out, and I'm going to look to Ms. Amadou. And I'm going to say that when we look at the health of a society, we ultimately have to look at the health of the mother. And maternal child health is indeed the major indicator of the health of any community, particularly the health of the Black community. And when we see rates of infant mortality in certain zip codes in St. Louis, including the Ville neighborhood, where the Homer G. Phillips Hospital was located, those infant mortality rates are 3, if not 4 times higher than of whites. And we're also seeing an unconscionable increase in Black maternal deaths, which shouldn't happen in a country like this. And it's for the same reasons. And so there are other indicators that are poor, but that in itself is an is a sign that something is ethically and morally wrong with this country when we allow infant mortality and maternal child health to do so poorly when we have the resources to ameliorate those conditions.
Yes. Thank you so much for laying that foundation, Dr. Ross. Ross, you're spot on. If we think about the way that a child is grown and carried and the stress factors that impact the mother and the environmental factors that are around her while she's pregnant with that child, a lot of issues for that child's future life is already pre-indicated. So those are the social determinants of health. We can already determine what type of issues this child may have for its future health. And so that is the biggest issue that we have in this city at this time. And so we can go in multiple different ways with it, but the core understanding is that when we think about prematurity or morbidity or mortality, a lot of those issues are already pre-indicated prior to a person even becoming pregnant. And that's some things that are often overlooked, where we want to try to provide a lot of things in pregnancy and jump on certain issues or risks that may come up. But when we understand that if a person has chronic toxic stress prior to pregnancy, because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, that we have time poverty, they don't have enough time to care for themselves. They're working multiple jobs because we have a pay wage gap. and they're not getting paid properly. They may be living in an impoverished housing because of these other things that I've mentioned. And then also let's think about the mental emotional health factors. How do you cope with being under a certain amount of stress and not being able to care for yourself? So insert a pregnancy for a Black woman who's already exhausted, underpaid, undervalued, and how do we expect her to truly be able to grow and nourish a baby in the best way possible? And yes, Jama Birth Village has been very influential in increasing access and knowledge to having a doula and to encouraging more people to access midwifery care in other hospital systems where it's available. However, a person is only spending on average about 10 to 12 hours with their respective OB provider. They may spend on average about 12 to 24 hours with their doula. So it's really a matter of, again, looking at the fact that racial segregation still exists. If even though it may not be intentionally clear, we know about the Delmar Divide, and we know about a lot of other communities where resources are intentionally cut off, and a lot of other issues are exasperated in these particular communities that are making it very hard for people to care for themselves when they're not even pregnant. So at Jama Birth Village, we do our best to not just care for the pregnant person, but to understand what's happening in their homes and in their environments. Who are the support people that you live with or work with? You know, invite them to a visit, put them, you know, on a virtual chat, have them come to a childbirth education training. We really have to think outside of putting the power in just the hands of the provider, because right now with all of the news that's saying Black women are dying at 3 to 5 times the rate. For every one person who dies in childbirth, 100 people are harmed. So that's morbidity. Understanding that the prematurity rate for Black women in the state of Missouri is 15+% compared to 9% for white women. So when that type of news is circulating so much, women are afraid. And the message is that you have to get a culturally congruent doula and a provider just to survive childbirth. And we need to put the power back into the hands of the people, and also the people who are around them, as we understand that family members, friends, or coworkers have the greatest influence on a person and the decisions that they make. So this year, Jama Birth Village is really focused on an initiative where we look at 20 of the most impoverished zip codes in the city of St. Louis, where we have the highest rates of disparities. We want to find 30 to 35 people in each one of those zip codes. We're not looking for healthcare professionals. We're not looking for middle and upper class people. We're looking for normal, everyday community members who may have someone in their family or friend or coworker circle who are pregnant. And we want to provide a one-day perinatal wealth education session for these individuals in their zip code so that they can understand how to support the people who are pregnant in their circle, and they can have the tools and resources to do it. If we're able to make sure that not just the providers have the education and the access to help somebody have a healthy pregnancy, and we make sure that the people around the pregnant person can do that, then I feel like we can really start to make way. With policies and procedures starting to lean more in the direction to address racial equity, I think that we can finally come to a culmination to actually address the real issues that are impacting maternal child health in this city.
Thank you so much. As I knew this was going to happen from this rich discussion, we would need another half an hour to even continue to explore issues with you, Ms. Amadou, and you, Dr. Ross. But we're going to now transition to our questions from the audience. And I understand from Emily that we have some dynamic questions. I want to just thank the two of you for really bringing into perspective the point that although we do not have legal racial segregation, institutional segregation, that we still have systemic issues of inequity that we need to deal with. So I'm going to turn this over to you now, Emily, for our audience questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. I'm going to be the stand-in audience member tonight since we're not able to be in person. And actually, Okunsola, I think the last thing you said kind of segues nicely into this question, which is what could the city do to reorganize healthcare delivery, especially primary care, to make it more accessible for all St. Louisans, focusing specifically on healthcare for those who don't have insurance?
Well, thanks. I'll take that because I have a role as a member of the Regional Health Commission. And our overall goal is to promote access to care, particularly for the uninsured and underinsured. Well, what we try to do is increase capacity for our local community health centers, the federally qualified health centers that we all know of, so that individuals can get the type of really comprehensive services that they need. What we really want to do is increase access to insurance, and we're successful, of course, with passage of the Medicaid expansion. We certainly know that that's under political attack. But when we do that, we're going to increase the access, particularly for adults who have to have less than 20% of federal poverty level to be eligible for Medicaid. And so we really want to put the appropriate pressure on the Missouri legislator to follow the people's will. Right now, only a fifth of individuals who could be covered by Medicaid with the expansion are doing so because of the delay in the expansion efforts, and that's an unfortunate intentional delay on the part of some legislators. And so we're working to, again, really create shared services among our community health centers, and we're working assiduously to promote the expansion as the people of Missouri agreed on when they voted for Medicaid expansion.
I'll just add a little bit to that. Dr. Ross, you did an amazing job really clarifying what could be helpful. I do understand that there are a lot of different programs that help to educate the community about other diseases and complications and disorders such as, diabetes and hypertension and other issues that often plague the Black community at higher rates than the white communities. So what I really think would be helpful is if we had more realistic, again, culturally competent education. So some of the handouts, the flyers, and even the trajectory and the delivery of the education does not fit the communities that are supposed to receive the information. So if we could have education that comes through a racial equity lens that is curated to the people that need to receive the message, then I feel like we will be much more successful with educating the community so that people can get timely health care. A lot of people don't know when something is wrong, what is normal and what's not normal. And some people will sit on a problem for a very long time with home remedies instead of actually going to seek the care that's needed. So I do feel like that could be a very helpful solution to think outside of the box and throw out some of the old ways of reaching people with education.
Access does not equal care. That's what you're saying, and that's absolutely correct.
Yes.
Well, the next question I had is actually about education, and more specifically the cost of education, and what role does the high cost of post-baccalaureate education play in potentially dissuading Black or low-income students from going into healthcare professions?
Well, I don't know if it's the cost of post-baccalaureate education that is the main impediment. I think there are a couple of issues. First, we have underfunded public education for decades, and we have reduce the scope of science facilities and other facilities, particularly in under-resourced neighborhoods, so that kids don't have access to these resources, and there's a disincentive for them to consider careers in medicine and biotechnology. Secondly, we have to look at what determines what predicts an outstanding clinician. And we are heavily reliant on standardized test scores, which we know are poorly correlated with excellence in medicine. Now, it's important that we have a more holistic approach, looking at all the full complement of a person and what they're going to bring in, their academic credentials, along with all the other skills and traits and other personal attributes that's going to make them an outstanding physician. So we need to move away from ranking schools based on standardized scores to ranking them based on the quality of students who are going to go out and care for disaffected and vulnerable populations.
Thank you. I'm actually going to shift a little bit to some history questions here. Actually, just some questions about it for people who are interested in learning more about the history of Homer G. Phillips Hospital and the nursing students there. Candace, we had a question about whether the pictures in your presentation are also the pictures in your book, and if it's possible to locate records of the nurses and nursing students and nursing assistants who were affiliated with Homer G.
Well, yes, most of the pictures I used are in the book. There are some others in the book that I didn't use in the presentation, which I think people might be interested in. As far as, I don't know of any one source that will list every nurse who ever worked at Homer G, but I will tell you that the nurses themselves, there's a very active Homer G. Phillips Nursing Alumni Association that meets every month, and it meets in the old Homer G. building, which, as I said, is now a senior living facility. And in the front hallway of that building, and you can all go in and see it, there's a beautiful plaque that lists all the nurses, class by class, who graduated from that training school over the years. So you could go in and see those names anytime.
Thank you so much. And hopefully everybody's getting online to buy your book also, so they can learn all of that history there as well.
Emily, I'll add that the Missouri Historical Society Research Center also has some records from Black nurses from City Hospital number 2 and some from Homer G. Phillips Hospital. It's been a long time since I've looked at them, but they are there.
Thank you, Priscilla. Yes, absolutely. The Library and Research Center on Skinker is just a treasure trove of resources. I'm going to put out one last question before we wrap up. This seems like a good one to wrap up on. It's what steps can be made to eliminate and dismantle policies that negatively influence Black American women maternal health? Clearly, the current framework of the healthcare system is broken, and current policies support that broken system.
Yes, and I know we only have a few minutes, and that is a whole book for me to write. But essentially, we've been saying it for years that we want policymakers to understand that lived experience matters. A lot of times, policies are really written upon data and evaluation that is very misconstrued and is not done through a racial equity lens. So using that backing oftentimes only gives very few benefits to the people that the policies are supposed to serve. So I really do feel like respecting community voices and community leaders that are actually on the ground doing the work and utilizing lived experiences, maybe in a qualitative data fashion, to help to develop policies and procedures that are made to benefit the people being served and not benefit a capitalist system. So people first over money, which may be hard, but it's totally possible.
I'll just add real quickly, I think the one policy that I would love to see adopted is a focus not just on prenatal care, but the full spectrum of woman's care, the care throughout the woman's whole cycle, life cycle.
Mhm.
And that type of care, there are models of how to do that. And I think when we embrace that and not leave a woman hanging 6 weeks after pregnancy and losing insurance and other resources, I think if we choose to look at the full scope of services a woman needs throughout her life, I think we'll be better as a society, not just as a Black group of, as a Black society, but as a society and whole. So
Yeah.
hopefully we can do that.
Emily, I wonder, I see that we have 1 minute left. I wonder if I could just take a piece of that and circle back to Homer G. Phillips for 1 minute, because I think there's one more thing I wanted to just convey to people that I think is very, that Homer
Please do.
was only around for 42 years. It was 1937 to 1979, but it had a tremendous impact, not only on St. Louis, but on the country. Not only did it, provide fine care to local patients, particularly during its heyday when it treated so many patients, and it was one of the best places in the city for critical care, but it also produced well-trained doctors and nurses who not only populated local hospitals, or took care of local patients, I should say, but went out throughout the country and, were present in many towns around the country. And nurses, some of the nurses I interviewed told me that all they had to do was go to a hospital and say, I was trained at Homer G, and they would say, you're hired, because everybody knew how great the training was. But the last thing I want to just mention is that Homer G's other aspect that I think is overlooked sometimes is that it was an engine for social change. You had lots of poor young women coming from, somehow they managed to get from rural Mississippi up to St. Louis, do the 3 years of training, and suddenly they were members of the middle class. And they had opportunities that their families had never had before. And the nurses told me that their children were doctors and lawyers, and this would never have happened if they had stayed home in rural Missouri. In fact, just one last 2 sentences here. One of the nurses said to me, and this was the reason for the title of the book, actually, you can't climb up if there's not a ladder or some way to move yourself up. In the areas where we came from, there were no opportunities. So Homer Phillips was the ladder for me, and I'm not sorry that I started climbing.
Thank you, Candace, for that final sort of quote to sum this all up. And I, as Priscilla said, it's never enough time. I think any one of these questions we could have spent another half hour on or more. It's a rich conversation and hopefully one that we'll be able to come back to. And I hope that you continue them in your own lives as well. I want to thank Priscilla for moderating the conversation. And I forgot to mention in my intro, but she is also currently writing a biography of the late civil rights activist, real estate attorney, and former national NAACP chairperson, Margaret Bush Wilson. So we'll be excited to see that coming soon, and keep your eyes peeled for it. I want to thank Candace O'Connor as well for her wonderful presentation. For our panelists, Dr. Will Ross and Okunsola Amadou, thank you so much for bringing your perspectives and giving us your time and energy this evening. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for logging in and joining us. We had a great turnout. This was a great conversation. Please don't forget to take a moment and fill out the survey. You'll find the link in the chat. And I also hope you link to the book sales and buy one or both of the books that we have for you tonight. If you buy them in the next 24 hours, we should be able to get you a signed copy to send to your doorstep. And I hope that we'll see some of you in person at our Thursday Nights at the Museum program next week, Race, Violence, and Justice, the Mink Slide. I hope that you can be there. So thanks so much. Stay safe and warm, and we'll see y'all later. Good night.
Good
Good night, everyone.
everyone.